since you've been in this game for 25 years, are we living in more contentious times now than we were 25 years ago?
The sad answer to that question is yes.
If I want to get a raise, what are the skills that I need to do it?
I would say one of the most counterintuitive but critical skills for great negotiators are a boss sometimes has some one-liners. Things are pressed, come back in 6 months. You do fabulous work. That's not how we typically do things here. No one's getting a raise. I may have so much power that I can force you to not take a lunch, not take a break, work 12 hours a day.
Goodbye. Negotiation expert Bob Bordone is a senior fellow at Harvard Law School and the founder of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law and the founder of the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. He joins us today to help you get a raise. Bob, how long have you taught negotiation?
So I think we're going on a quarter of a century, Paula, 25 years, 21 years full-time at Harvard Law School. And then for the past 5 years, mostly executive education, working in all sorts of corporate and nonprofit environments, and also still doing some adjunct teaching the last few years at Georgetown Law School.
Mm-hmm. So since you've been in this game for 25 years, are we living in more contentious times now than we were 25 years ago?
So I think the sad answer to that question is yes, although I also think that there is a perception that we're in a lot more contention than we were a quarter of a century ago, and I'm not sure that's true. What I think is true is that our capacity to handle those differences and conflicts is significantly lower now than it was a quarter of a century ago. And that seems troubling to me, and in many respects, a real impetus for the work that I've been really trying to do for the past 5 years since I left Harvard Law School.
But so the work that you do, can you clarify it for me? Because you teach negotiation, and yet the class that you taught at Harvard Law, at least one of them, was called The Lawyer as Facilitator. So already I'm seeing a distinction here between negotiation and facilitation. And then in reading more about your work, it seems as though you do a lot in conflict resolution and also conflict resilience. What are the differences between all of these and what are the similarities?
Sure, yeah. It's a little bit of a word jumble, I think, for kind of the average person who's just like, I need a raise or I'm in a dispute with my boss. But I could say this, right? So when I think of negotiation, sometimes I think what comes to mind is something that happens between the president and Congress, or maybe when you're buying or selling a car, or maybe when you are asking for a raise. And those are all negotiations that fall into something that we would broadly call deal making. Mm-hmm. But another domain of negotiation is when we are in disagreement with each other. Who needs to do the dishes? Whose fault is it that the conference went poorly? So conflict resolution is, I would say, a subset of negotiation. Then you asked about facilitation. So facilitation is really a process by which some third party helps people who are in conflict or who are trying to reach a deal actually get to that deal. And there's a big Venn diagram of overlap in terms of skills. And then there are some skill sets that are, I think, distinct to each of those particular processes.
At the 30,000-foot view level, what are the skills needed to be a good negotiator, and what are the skills needed to be a good facilitator? And really where I'm going with this question is, if I want to get a raise, right? If I want to go to my boss and say, give me an extra 10 grand, what are the skills that I need to do it?
Yeah, so if you are getting a raise, if you want more vacation or benefits, that is purely in negotiation land because you are advocating for yourself. It's a process by which you are trying to influence someone's choice. I would say one of the most counterintuitive but critical skills for great negotiators are good listeners. Really deep listeners, people who have a deep sense of curiosity about the perspective of the other. And here's why. Because to be a great negotiator, you need to frame choices for the other side that are easy for them to say yes to, that are attractive for them to say yes to. And the best way to be able to do that is to understand them. And the more curious you are, the better listener you are, the more you'll know how they think, because you get them speaking, and that helps you frame, how do I kind of make this best choice for them? So listening, number one, over the top. By the way, that's also true for facilitation. Second really important skill, though, I would say, is being able to advocate for yourself. And to be able to advocate in an effective way your full set of interests. So when I say full set, at one level, right, you want to raise, and that's really important. But underlining that, right, might be promotion, issues of status, financial security, maybe thinking about increasing rents, maybe wanting to be set up for a new position in the organization. And so being able to kind of advocate effectively for that wide set of underlying interests is the second really important skill in negotiation. And then I could go on, but I'll give you one more. And that it's really related to listening, but it's perspective taking. The ability to kind of view the world from the perspective of the person you're trying to influence. And I think a really common error that people make in negotiation is that they think it's about leverage. It's about who has more power. And it is certainly a way to get what you want by using leverage. It's just not the most effective way. Because if I use my leverage against you on Monday and I get what I want, how are you feeling on Tuesday and Wednesday? You don't like me very much. And then you're going to be spending time trying to get leverage on me for next time. But if I understand what's important to you, and then I can frame a choice in a way that's attractive to you, then we're both getting what we want. That helps build long-term interest.
So you mentioned two things. You talked about deep listening, but you also talked about advocating for yourself. There are some who would say that empathy is at odds with assertiveness.
Yeah. So one of the things we talk about is making this distinction between empathy and assertiveness. And I would actually say that it might be an experienced tension, but it's not an actual one, meaning that I can fully appreciate what you're feeling, why you see the world the way you do, what's important to you, without ever giving anything up in a negotiation or a conflict. Assertiveness is simply my ability to advocate for what's important to me. And what we often do is we confuse empathy with sympathy or giving something up because we feel sorry for somebody. And that's not really what empathy is. And I think that there's actually a lot of research around this, right? Folks who are both empathic and assertive tend to get better outcomes in negotiations. One of the things that in the work that I do is we often notice that people tend to fall more into one or the other bucket. There are people, using your example of asking for a raise, right? I mean, there's some people who'll be up, nights on end, stressed about this, right? What if they say no? Like, oh my gosh, am I being too bold? Like, maybe I don't deserve this. And, oh, I could see their poor boss is pressed or the organization, has a hiring freeze. And how could I do this? And so they're very empathic, but they're losing sight of the fact that they've been there for 5 years and their cost of living increases. Then there are other people, I think, I wouldn't call them assertive. They're kind of aggressive, but they're just like, yeah, take it or leave it. This is what I should get and I deserve it. And so part of the skill in being effective in both negotiation and in conflict is actually there's a both and there. You can put forward your own needs and you could also embrace the needs of the other and then frame that as a shared problem. What do we do about that? How do we move forward?
Right. But there's the internal and external element. It's easy for me to see how externally, sure, a person can be both empathic and assertive, but I can also see how internally, the more empathic I am to someone's perspective, the more I can really see things from their perspective, to the point where I can argue their side better than they can. It actually then causes me to doubt my own position. So it isn't that I'm failing to be externally assertive, it's that my conviction of my own position internally has weakened.
Yeah, this is such a huge challenge. It's like, oh, this is disappointing. But I think precisely for the point you're making, Paula, which is, I think typically for most of us, there is some side of us that can see the perspective of the other. As human beings, we want to feel connected, right? And we want to be empathic. And then there's another side of us that still feels like I have needs and I deserve this. I think the task is, and this is going to vary for individual people, to actually hold on to both. So if you're somebody whose tendency is to lose yourself in that process of empathy, the work you need to do is giving that assertive side, that legitimate side that maybe wants to say no, more voice. And this may seem like a mind trick, but I don't think it is. It's actually saying this side also needs empathy. The side of you that says, yeah, I don't really want to work 7 days a week for the next month. Or it really isn't okay that I haven't gotten a raise in 3 years. That side of you deserves as much empathy as the boss telling you that they're pressed, or your colleague saying that they really need off the next 3 weekends. And so doing the kind of internal work to both name those different voices inside yourself, the side of you that knows you deserves it, the side of you that also wants to be a people pleaser, and then saying these each need to be a part of the negotiation and the conversation, because if I just pre-silence my own needs, then yeah, you're not going to get the raise, right? Your empathic side is going to override the other side, and you're ultimately going to be left disappointed with yourself. And so a lot of coaching work that I do is helping people amplify that side of themselves that kind of knows that they do deserve it, but can get doubt, maybe because of their family of origin, maybe because of cultural issues, maybe personality-wise. They tend to be someone who just wants to make others happy, or they were taught maybe the role they played in their family was that you're always the one who's the mediator and the problem solver. So they're solving everyone else's problems, except there's that side of them that still knows they need something, and that problem isn't solved.
Right. You mentioned that then that's the work that they would need to do. How tactically, actionably does a person do that work? I mean, what are the elements of actual practice?
Yes. So a lot of this starts before you get to the proverbial negotiation table. We have this kind of 3-part preparation, if you will, called mirror work, chair work, and table work. And the mirror work is we've been talking about so far. Like, how do I give names to each of the sides of myself that are in play in this particular conflict, which can be a salary negotiation. It could be, though, how do I say no to somebody? And by mirror, what we're trying to get people to do is give themselves a kind of accurate reflection of each of these sides. Accurate, what I mean is, I think, again, by dint often of like our upbringing or maybe a family role we played or a personality, we can sometimes have these kind of what I call a circus mirror. You know how like these mirrors you go and they kind of distort you and they make you look super long,
Right.
or super skinny or do some weird things to your face, and it's not really accurate. And so part of this, I think, involves both writing out, almost creating different seats or chairs for each of these identities or stories. The side of you that maybe feels like asking for something is selfish. The side of you that feels like asking for something is being cruel. The side of you that also feels like you've worked pretty darn hard. And so you lay them all out. And then the second piece is the chair work. And we use the word,
Wait, sorry.
stop. Yeah, good.
Yeah. So what you're saying then with the mirror work is that there are different elements of you. So you, version A, in no particular order, is that side of you that thinks that making this request is selfish, especially if you know that the company is struggling and you have a hiring freeze. So side of you A is that side.
Yep.
Side of you B is the side that knows that you're working really hard and feels like you want some recognition for that. Side of you C is the side of you that is really anxious because we live in these inflationary times. And so these aren't necessarily opposing sides. They're simply multifaceted sides.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And sometimes they might be opposing or feel opposing, But the fact that they feel or might be opposing doesn't make them any less real or legitimate. I think the mistake that happens, depending on who you are as a person, but folks who really struggle with the assertiveness piece, pre-shut down the side that says, I've worked really hard here. And they over-amplify the empathy side and the anxiety side. And then they don't ask. Or they think, until I can somehow resolve all three of these, it's too confusing to actually have the negotiation. Like, I need to be certain. And I think the mirror work is actually saying, yeah, you are certain. Each of these is real. And you could bring each of them into the conversation. And in fact, that's often a good opening into the conversation.
So what is the purpose then of doing that mirror work? Is it simply to recognize the multidimensional elements that comprise you?
It is both to recognize them and also to, I would say, depolarize them or judge them, because just to take them for what they are. Because I think that where we get stuck in assertiveness is that we are kind of vaguely aware of all the pressures the boss has and wanting to be seen as a good person. Then maybe we muster the courage, like, for a nanosecond to say, like, maybe I could get a raise this year. It's like you're up like for 3 weeks thinking about this, and then that's the way you start the negotiation. And then, of course, that's not going to work. And then you go home and feel bad. But if we've kind of done that pre-work of naming each of these sides, of giving some sense of, yeah, that's actually okay, that's legit, it gives us some more power, I think some more kind of psychological safety and certainty to actually bring that forward into the room confidently. And that's really what the prep work is about.
All right. So that is the mirror work.
That's the mirror work,
and
yeah.
Mirror is one of 3 elements. It's the first of 3 elements.
Yeah. So the second piece, right, which is what we call chair work, is still part of preparation. And what it is now that I kind of have identified, we could continue to use our example, right, our 3 different sides here. The side that kind of feels bad for the boss and wants to be a people pleaser, the side that also knows you've worked really, really hard and just on the merits deserve a raise, and then the side that is actually just feeling anxious about being able to pay the bills. The chair work is literally, and when we really recommend this, and I actually do this when I coach, I'll say, let's set up 3 chairs. The physicality of it, I think, is really powerful. And I want you to go back and forth in each of these chairs and have the chairs have a conversation with each other. And sometimes people will look at you like, oh, okay, that's weird. Like, can I just do it in this chair? And I'm like, you can. But I want to encourage you to do the chairs, because there's something about the physicality that forces each of those chairs to actually get a voice. And there's 2 things. I think it's confidence building. It's also really diagnostic, because what I'll sometimes see is, for example, just again, to continue with our example, the empathy chair might start to silence the you worked hard chair. Well, you worked hard, but you know what? You could wait another 6 months. And they'll be like, okay, now get up and sit. I want the assertive chair to respond to the empathy chair. What? I just wanted to respond. And they'll be like, I've been waiting for 4 years. And so that kind of work, I think, just builds that confidence level up and sets you up for the next step, right?
So basically, the chair exercise then is almost an acting improv exercise in which each side of you gets broken out into a caricature.
Absolutely.
A one-dimensional caricature.
Yes.
And then you just embody that one-dimensional caricature when you're sitting in that particular chair.
Yes.
So you can fully embody it.
Amen. That is it.
Wow.
That is it. I think it's really empowering. And as I said, diagnostic for people. Because again, folks who struggle with that assertiveness piece get a little window onto what's hard about it. And I think it helps them realize, like, yeah, this side doesn't sound crazy.
Could this exercise work? Let's say that, could you do it in a group? Like, do you yourself have to play all 3 elements of yourself? Or could you play one element and then have 2 other people who are embodying the other 2 caricatures?
Yeah, I mean, great question. In the dream world, if you have a team of people who could help you on this, it's so much better. I mean, and I've been very fortunate in some of the kind of executive coaching work that I've been able to do where we can have a team. Or even sometimes, right, I'll jump into one of the chairs and I'll be like, okay, I'm going to be, you stay in your little empathic one and I'm going to go and be assertive you, right? And we could really have a conversation. And that I think is a wonderful way to prepare. I think you can do it on your own. And most of us maybe don't necessarily have at hand, a set of people. But if you have that, take advantage of it for sure.
Yeah. I can imagine that way, if you take a turn in each one of those chairs with two other people embodying, then you get a chance, like when let's say we've got these three dimensions of us, right? There's the side of you, the empathic side of you that understands that you work for a company that's struggling and you feel bad for your boss and you feel bad for the company and you know that the company doesn't have a lot of money, and that's the empathic side of you. You've got the assertive side of you who's like, look, I work hard and I feel like I've earned it. And then you've got the anxious side of you that's worried about macroeconomic conditions. And it's so easy, as you mentioned, the other sides to shout down one of them. I could see that in a role play actually happening. And so if you've got these other people in the room, then you could actually experience those other sides shouting down the one side and then experience what it's like to fight through that.
Amen. I mean, that is exactly right. My background and training, as we said in the beginning, is in law. But at some point in my teaching, we entered into a collaboration with a bunch of family therapists at the Cambridge Family Institute. Mm-hmm. And I found that experience to be really transformative for the way I think about my work and the way people show up or don't show up in conflict and negotiation settings. Actually, this really interesting internal family systems piece of this work that we're talking about here, which is why I think that identifying these different sides, and then if you have this opportunity to bring others in to help you with this, I think it just helps to, I'm going to use this word, depolarize the kind of negative valence that certain of these identities sometimes have for people. The kind of identity of maybe asserting for yourself that was just kind of coded as being a troublemaker, or as not okay, or as not caring for the others in the family. Or on the other side, just we focused a lot here on the person who isn't that assertive, but maybe on the person who struggles with the empathy piece or is extremely aggressive. In some situations, right, people grow up and it's like, if you don't stand up for yourself, you're a nobody. And if you show a little bit of care and concern, you're gonna get taken advantage of. And so realizing that you can't be a super effective negotiator if all you do is plow through people all the time. You can in a moment, maybe you get the raise, but guess what? Your boss is like, this person's a pain. I don't really want them around. And doing this work, I think, of the chairs, I love the idea of bringing other people in, is such critically important. Just one last thing I'll say about this, because I'm imagining at least some of your listeners is like, who has time for this?
Right.
Like, I got 3 kids, to go to basketball practice, whatever else, shovel the snow,
Right.
And what I would just say to that is, are you going to do this for every single negotiation in your life? Probably not. But if it's something like a raise that's been haunting you, if it's important negotiation with maybe your spouse over where you're spending the holidays, which by the way is a negotiation, and it's important to you and you get into a fight over it every single year, yeah, it might be worth the prep. It might actually, in the long run, be a time saver for you to do the prep work.
Right. Okay. So the first step of the prep work is that mirror work. The second step is the chair work, which we've just discussed. What is the third step?
And the third step is the table work, which is the actual doing of it. So we say the proverbial table, meaning I'm now going to go into the conversation. What that really entails, I mean, I would say the simplest way to talk about this is, what is an opening that can bring together all 3 chairs in this case in a way that is authentic and inviting and draws the boss into a conversation that doesn't make them feel up against a wall or attacked. And the simplest way, just the simplest way to do that, and this is how chair work can often bleed right into table work, is to just give a voice to each of the chairs. So just to play out this example with you, I might say, there's a side of me that's incredibly hesitant to raise this with you, dear boss, because I know that we've been struggling here this fiscal year. There's another side of me that feels it's quite important and appropriate. And frankly, there's just an economic reality side that I'm considering is making my own life quite challenging. And I wonder if we could have this conversation. Or something like that. I mean, maybe I could have phrased it a little better there, but maybe a little bit more succinctly. But the naming of the ambivalence as an opening is both more authentic. There's nothing weak about that. If the boss says, you're right, we have economic problems and I'm sorry you can't afford the eggs, doesn't take away from but there's still this side of me that has to meet these things. So we together, dear boss, have to figure out a way to be sensitive to the economic realities you're facing, the economic realities I'm facing, and what I just think would be kind of fair given the benchmarks I've made or the KPIs I've earned, whatever it might be.
Right.
And then, then it goes from there, right? So then it's like, how do I make sure I've done the work to understand what the norms or, the criteria might be for the right salary? How do I listen appropriately to what the boss might be putting forward? How do I be creative about some outcomes that might work? Which doesn't mean, so I think really importantly, that like you leave this either with the raise or without the raise, right? It might be much more creative than that. I mean, it might be a little raise now and something down the road. It might be some flexible time to do some other work. It might be one or two things that you've agreed to over the next 3 months that are going to happen, and then you will get the raise. But you want to leave the room with some sense of knowing what's going to happen next, not just the boss got you out of the room and you have some idea that you can come back in 6 months.
Right.
That's not a good outcome.
Right. And so when you get to the table, giving voice to all of these different facets of you actually enhances that conversation.
It does, yeah. And then, of course, you want to make space for them, right? Very context specific. But one of the things that, from a boss perspective, is you probably haven't thought as hard about it as the employee, because you have a bunch of employees. A boss sometimes has like some one-liners. Things are pressed, come back in 6 months. You do fabulous work, but if I give this to you, everyone else is going to be knocking on my door. That's not how we typically do things here. No one's getting a raise. All of those kinds of, I call them one-liners, are designed to skedaddle you out of the room. And this is where both the empathy and the assertiveness piece come together. They're married. When the boss says something like, if I give you the raise, everybody else is going on a raise. The empathy move is, so one real worry here is that this is going to create an avalanche of problems for you. That's the empathy move. Yes, you got it. And then you say, yeah, I could appreciate that would be challenging. At the same time, it feels to me like, for any number of reasons that you would list out, like I'm still deserving of some salary adjustment here. I wonder what we can do that would actually help me both sets of those concerns. Maybe this is the better example to your earlier question, Paula, of how do you combine the empathy and the assertiveness?
Right.
You take in what they're saying. You don't fight what they're saying. You don't say that's unimportant. If you were the boss, it would be important. Right. Of course it'd be important.
Right.
It doesn't take away the legitimacy of what you're saying. How do we try to find something that actually does both of these things? That's the shared problem.
And then it's us against the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
You got it.
Then it's not you versus me. It's us against the problem.
Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier. You were talking about interests. People have different sets of interests. And then you contrasted that with power. A lot of times people will try to flex their power in a situation. And so I was wondering if you could talk about how rights, power, and interest, how all of those things play together in a conversation like this.
Sure. None of the three of those things can be eliminated, right, in any kind of negotiation or any kind of conflict context. Power, right, really, there's lots of articles that have been written on power negotiation, and my own definition of it, right, is a really simple one, which is it's the ability to persuade. But I think a more traditional way of thinking about power is my ability to force you to do something. And people who are in positions of power, often because of they have more money or they're the boss or they can use physical force in some ways, will often use that power to get their way. The problem with that is it often leaves a lot of value on the table. Interests in kind of our negotiation speak are what are the underlying needs or concerns of the parties, the things that really matter to them. And when we're able to shift a negotiation away from power and toward interests, usually that enables some more value creation. So if it's just about, I asked you for a raise, I have a lot, I have too many demands, I'm going to have too many people knocking on my door, the answer is no. I guess the person with the power ends it, and the answer is no. Now, the reality, though, is that the employee probably has some power. If they're highly valued, do good work, they can always walk away, but in that moment, they don't have so much power. But the beauty of the empathy assertiveness mix is if I can get you to talk about the interest, embrace your interest, which in this case is not set a bad precedent and have 20 other employees asking for a raise, and you can appreciate my interest, which is simply getting an appropriate increase in my pay, that opens up a completely different conversation. Now, your third thing you asked about is rights. So now we're in kind of more of a legal land, I would say. Not legal land, but usually I would say rights come up in conflict or negotiation scenarios as a way to check abuses of power. Mm. So in an employment context, right, I may have so much power that I can force you to not take a lunch, not take a break, work 12 hours a day. But at some point, I'm probably violating some labor laws, right? And so now I'm going to take a rights-based approach to stop your abuse of power. And maybe I'm going to call in HR. Maybe I'm going to file a lawsuit or go to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So just from a conflict perspective and a negotiation perspective, as much as possible, for the good of all parties, we want people to be thinking about how do I bring forward my interests? Because that opens the most capacity for creating joint value and building better relationships. But that is a harder and harder thing to do in higher conflict and lower trust environment that we are tending to see more and more in our country and in our workplaces and our schools.
You mentioned that we are in a higher conflict and lower trust environment, more so now than ever before. One element of that is that there's some differentiation around what even constitutes a conflict. There are some people who would view a given exchange as a conflict, while others would view that same exchange as not a conflict. And there are also those who, by viewing that exchange as a conflict, they would then react by either being combative or by being avoidant, whereas others would not. Can you talk about that element of all of this?
Yeah, I love this question. This is one of the fun areas that my co-author and I explored in our own collaboration. And so let me first of all say what we mean by this, right? At the level of what do we mean by a conflict? It sounds terrible and horrible, but we really just think of the conflict as when people are not seeing eye to eye, when people have differences. Mm-hmm. And I want to frame it in that kind of lower level because I want to try to normalize conflict as something that is actually a healthy part of life. We didn't name the book Conflict Resolution, and we didn't name the book Conflict Avoidance. We named it Resilience because we think that part of being with other people and working with them in a family and an organization means conflict. So the issue isn't whether we're going to have this, but how do we deal with it? So that's the first thing I would just say. Mm-hmm. Within that range, though, I would say of differences, we have different sensibilities of when kind of our brains go into a panic, when we kind of feel this heightened sense of this is not just us talking about differences, but this is something that's going to the relationship, something that is eviscerating the trust. And we have different conflict tolerance, and we have different conflict what we call conflict recognition levels.
Right.
Meaning that, so I have a very high conflict recognition level. Like you and me, Paula, we might, I don't know, pick some topic.
Okay.
Whatever it is.
Cheetos.
Cheetos,
are
yeah.
flaming hot Cheetos better or worse than regular Cheetos?
Yeah, really dislike flaming hot Cheetos, right?
I love flaming hot Cheetos.
All right, and we could go at this, and it might be the case. So for me, because I have a high conflict recognition, I might go at this for 25 minutes. I think it's completely fun. That was such a great conversation. I go home, sleep like a baby.
Right.
But for someone like, for my co-author,
Right.
he'd be like, oh my gosh, that was horrible.
Terrible.
Terrible.
He doesn't share my views on flamin' hot Cheetos.
Yeah, and I might have hurt the relationship by doing that.
Right.
Like Bob fought so hard. Like, I don't even know. Like, is he going to want to have dinner on Friday? How are we going to continue this collaboration? I'm like, that was wicked fun.
Right.
He's like, oh my gosh, that was awful. I can't sleep at night.
Right. And so that's conflict recognition.
Yeah, conflict recognition, right? Then there's the moment of what happens when it is registering for me or anybody as a conflict. What is our ability to stick with or stay with that, which we call conflict holding? So what's interesting about me is you and I could have our Cheetos debate for a long time, and it could be fierce, but as long as I'm not feeling like that was a relationally damaging level of conflict, I'm in. As soon as I feel like, for me, oh my gosh, like she was really offended. Her dad invented
Flamin' hot Cheetos.
I'm like offended her family. Right. Now for me, this is not something I need to work on, right? My conflict holding is pretty low. I suddenly go into apology mode and relationship building mode. And you might go home and have like sent from Uber Eats, like mounds of flaming hot Cheetos waiting for you.
Well, yeah. Well, if my family invented flaming hot Cheetos, then it's an attack on identity.
Right? Yeah, it's even worse, right?
Yeah.
And that identity thing is the kind of thing that for me might trigger, oh, now we're in a sense of, we are really in a real big conflict here. And my holding ability goes low. One of the things we've often seen is that relationships can fall apart because we're not sensitive or aware that our conflict recognition and holding levels are different. And so that in itself sometimes could be a really healthy and good conversation, right? I have this like ridiculous story from when I was in high school. My best friend and I were going up to a trip in Montreal. So at that time I was living right outside New York City. That's where I grew up. And we got into this big fight. And it was 2 a.m. and we were still fighting. And all he kept on saying is, can we just talk about this in the morning? Like, why are we having this fight? And I was like, no, like, how could you possibly even think about going to sleep with this major conflict going on, right? And he literally left the room. And because we were, kids, we were like sharing a hotel room and didn't come back till the morning. But I think a lot of that, right, had to do with my own low conflict holding and that discomfort that I had in letting it go unresolved. I felt for the things to be right, it needed to be patched over. And now, I don't think I'm perfect at this by any stretch of the imagination, but becoming more conflict resilient is being able to be like, you know what, like that was kind of rough. It's a little bit uncomfortable. And like, this relationship is more durable than that. It could live with this kind of conflict. And strong, better relationships should be able to live with some degree of disagreement and conflict and not fall apart.
Right. Okay, so just to make sure I'm understanding the terminology correctly. So conflict recognition is the recognition of whether or not this constitutes a conflict in the first place, and people have either low or high thresholds for that. Conflict holding is comfort with that conflict remaining unresolved, and people have high or low thresholds for that.
Correct.
And those are independent variables.
Yes.
And so is there an optimal place to be? Is there a statistical average that we should all be aiming for?
Definitely the answer to that is no. I think what we do say, so we have these diagnostic quizzes to kind of help measure your own both recognition and holding levels. I think that one of the things we would say, well, two things we would say. One is that wherever you are at, there's ability for growth, where I would say growth would mean being able to kind of sit in the heat of the disagreement more. So, because sometimes people say, like, I just can't, I'm so uncomfortable, I can't handle conflict. And it's like, well, you could still improve with some intentional practice. The second thing I would just say, though, and I think this is probably the more important piece, is the awareness of these differences between us give us another domain for how to talk about how we will talk about the hard things together. So we use this example of two siblings who have these unproductive fights over political differences where the sister kind of shuts down immediately. And then the brother kind of thinks like, well, she obviously just gave up and knows I'm right. But that's actually not what's happening. What's happening is the brother isn't recognizing that the way he's doing this is creating such a level of discomfort and high conflict for the sister that she's thinking, I can't handle this. And the sad thing about it is that both of them would actually like to have a conversation about this political difference. So giving them the language to talk about the ways they're experiencing the conversation also gives them a way to have the conversation in a different way that then allows them to sit with the discomfort of disagreement and actually engage the issues more. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
How would you go about this when there is a power imbalance between the two parties, such as a boss with an employee?
Yeah. So this is a tough one. But I think part of what I would say is if there's like a certain dynamic that comes up a lot, and there's a power dynamic as well, but maybe it's a way in which we are experiencing each other. I think that the employee needs to find some way to kind of reach out to the boss in a very direct way and ask for some time. And not to be mysterious about it, but this is a both and aspect to it, right?
Ask for some of the boss's time, you mean? Or ask
for some of the boss's time to actually discuss the dynamic that they're experiencing. So maybe I'm just making this up, right? Maybe it's an experience of every time we have a meeting, I feel like we have 20 minutes scheduled, but half of that time you're like looking at your texts. You're like fiddling around, you're like glancing over there for the email. And I find that challenging and hard and disrespectful. Might not say disrespectful, actually. But I find it challenging and hard. But so the dynamic is my boss is doing this thing that's really annoying. It makes me feel like really small. And there's a power dynamic there. But it doesn't mean the employee can't talk about this. The employee has to actually carve out some time when the dynamic isn't happening and talk about this observed dynamic. And one of the things we talk about is framing it very much as an observation. One thing I notice when we meet often is your texts are going off, your email's going off. There's lots of things happening. And then again, not to be a broken record, this is where I think both empathy and assertiveness come in. It's just not around salary, it's around something different. I'm curious for you if that's something you're aware of and what your experience of it is. What's it like for you? Yeah, I can barely focus at all. Like you have no idea how exhausting this job is, right? Whatever they're going to say. Or, that's just life being the boss. That's another thing I might say. Life being the boss, right? Whatever it is. But if they say it's life being the boss, more empathy. Well, what is that like? Then the second piece is whatever they say, life being the boss. I'm so sorry. I'm busy a lot of the time, just trying to keep up. That's the assertiveness piece. Here's how I experience it. Sometimes as distracting, sometimes as wondering whether you're hearing what I'm saying or whether it's important. And I wonder how we could address the busyness you have and how hard it is for you to find 20 minutes and also make this maximal use of my time in a way that makes me feel our meetings are worthwhile. That is harder to do in a power dynamic, but it's not impossible to do. And I think the one thing I would say, Paula, on this is that anyone who's a good boss will see this as leadership. Because I know someone who has been a boss in the past, right? The more you go up a ladder, the less frequently people are direct and honest with you. And really good leaders want people who will actually tell them what's going on, because you can't make good decisions otherwise. So that might lead to another question, which is like, what if my boss is a jerk? But you didn't ask that question. Right? That's a much more complicated question in my mind than what if the person just has more power.
All right. So then what if your boss...
You can ask that question. Why did I do that? Yeah. So I think if your boss is a jerk. So a few things I would think about. One, so there's some diagnostic questions. Do they do behaviors of a jerk? Or do you genuinely think they're a jerk? For many years, I taught in the exec ed program at the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. And they have these programs called Dealing with Difficult People, which I really dislike the title of it. And the reason why I dislike the title is, do I think there are difficult people in the world? I do. I think that we have a much wider set of people we call difficult that are actually not really difficult people. There are people who use difficult behaviors. And difficult behaviors are things that are telling us some need that that person has that isn't being met, and they're not skillful at putting that forward. So you can deal with them. So first question, I mean, we could go into this probably for a long time, right? But really doing some diagnostic work of, is this truly a jerk, or is this a person who is doing jerky things? If they're really like, you really feel like at some level, this is someone who maybe is clinically a narcissist, then I think you have to really think about, how do I find a way out of this situation? Maybe not tomorrow morning, but how do I look for other employment, improve my alternatives in some way? Because long-term, this isn't good for you.
Right.
If they just have challenging behaviors, I think they're addressable, and they're probably addressable through, at the risk of being a broken record, really good listening. Because so often, something that is blame, or it's an attribution, or it's an attack on you, is a marker for feelings that they're having.
Right.
And if you can reflect those feelings back to them several times as a feeling, instead of getting defensive, often they calm down. Are they likely to be the most skillful person? Are you going to put them in the video of all-time great empathic leaders? Probably not. But could they be worked with? Yes. And so those kinds of diagnostic questions, I think, are really important, that are always being measured against what opportunities exist for you outside of this particular workplace. One of the things I just love about your podcast is it's about really empowering people. And I think just such a critical piece, if like there's one thing I would want your listeners to leave with, is like whether they're negotiating for a salary, negotiating for a promotion, negotiating over a real estate, low power, you have agency. As a human being, you have legitimate interests. And if someone is in a conversation with you, whether it's they want you to work 15 hours a day, they want you to take a pay cut, they want you to have all the family holidays with their family and not yours, the fact that they're in that interaction with you means that you have some power in that, and you have some agency in that, and you have some ability to speak and persuade and be heard. And anyone who tells you otherwise, right, is wrong. Foundationally, like negotiation and conflict resilience is about hope. It's about the ability to influence and persuade. And sometimes when I teach longer courses, like these 2 or 3 day executive workshops, someone in the first day will say like, well, I didn't do that. I didn't take this move because I felt I couldn't persuade them anyway, or it was pointless, or this is the safest thing I could do to stem my losses, right? If your attitude is about stemming your losses, right? It's like, oh my gosh, why are you in a negotiation class? This whole class is about, how do I influence? How do I persuade? How do I take my sets of interests, what I know is true, and the power that I have, and make something?
Negotiation is about influence and persuasion and agency.
Yeah.
It's all of those things.
Yeah. One of the things that like I would also just say, right, is that's why there is so much power in disagreement and in saying no. Because whether it's in a relationship or at work, whenever I put that first no forward, all of the other yeses suddenly have some meaning, because the first no means that the yeses were actually yeses. If you've been in a relationship with someone for 6 months and you never had a squabble or a dispute, whew, not a good sign, right? You know, because it's like the mark of really strong relationships, and this I think also goes to conflict resilience, is not how do we get along because we both like, what's it called? Super hot Cheetos or
Flamin' hot Cheetos.
Hot Cheetos. Yeah. It's how do we handle the fact that I don't like them and you do, or that you're a Yankees fan and I'm a Red Sox fan, or that fill in the blank. Mm-hmm. If we can work through those differences, that's a real relationship. If it's just like we agree on everything, it's nice, but I'm not sure it's the mark of a super strong relationship.
Right. You don't know if you're skilled at disagreeing with one another.
Yeah. And you need that to make it work with people, right? And I think you need that even internally to be able to name the internal disagreements and be like, that's okay. It's okay that sometimes I'm generous and I have a selfish side as well, and like, welcome to humanity. And both of those sides need to be met and fed and are deserving.
You mentioned the importance of listening. Let's say you have a boss who is not a jerk, meaning they're not a clinical narcissist, but they do exhibit jerky behavior. And you talked about how that often is a reflection of some unmet need, and they are expressing that unmet need in a maladaptive way. And you mentioned listening as a potential solution, but doesn't that presuppose that they have the self-awareness to even know what they themselves are feeling or experiencing?
Well, I'm going to give you like a partial yes on that, right? I mean, it's certainly easier if they have that capacity. I think having said that, really good listening can sometimes help people discover a little bit more of that set of needs. And I think that there's a line between taking on the role of the unwanted therapist that they don't want. And that's definitely not what we mean to be saying here. On the other hand, some of the listening at even just a kind of professional level can just kind of calm them down in a way that they might not even be able to name themselves, of being kind of seen or as important or valuable, or maybe even the boss, right? Now, the need to be the boss probably has a bunch of other needs that we're not going to get into in the workplace, but that need can be met with some active listening that might tone down other performative behaviors that they're doing to show you that they're the boss. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that? I'm so curious.
Well, I think back to elements in my own life where I had certain emotional needs that were unmet, but at the time I didn't consciously realize that the reason that I was upset was because of some bigger or deeper unmet need. So I would think that I was upset because someone cut me off in traffic, or because I accidentally stepped in a puddle and now my socks are wet.
Yeah.
I would look at the immediate irritant in front of me and think that that immediate irritant was the source of my distress, and wouldn't even realize that there was actually some bigger context around it.
Yeah. And I think those things do come up, right, in work examples. I also think that if there's some trust between like boss and employee, a little bit of that listening, I think, does advance just some self-reflection in the boss. And is something that probably most of the other team members aren't doing, which I think then build some affiliation and some connection, even if the boss isn't like going home and journaling about that, per se. But yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously very context dependent. And as in all of these choices, it's how important is this to the person who has to do this work? Because really good listening is exhausting.
Right.
It takes a lot of work. And it's not just sitting there for a few minutes and saying, aha, aha, going home, I mean, that doesn't take a lot of work. But again, like I think so many of the kinds of themes that people end up having sleepless nights about or talk to their spouse about with their boss, right? That if you're thinking about it a lot, if you're talking to your friends about it a lot, if you're venting at your book club about it a lot, then there's something there that probably says it is at least important enough to spend some more time strategizing on what you might do than just saying, oh, well, they suck.
Right.
You know? And everyone says, yeah, let's get another glass of wine, right? And I think maybe that's the invitation for the work. Is it the case that every single conflict that comes across your transept, you should be conflict resilient and do all these things? No, like you'd be a puddle, you'd be exhausted. But is it the case that each of us should have a set of conflict resilience skills for those moments that most matter, whether it's asking for a raise, right, which is not only in the moment, but your whole retirement and future, or when I am asking a bunch of due diligence questions before I buy a business, and maybe I've asked a bunch of questions and now some surprising and concerning thing at the 11th hour comes up and I'm like, oh, well, maybe I should have said that earlier, or maybe it's too late, or maybe it's not a big deal. And right. And you're all in your head. I'm like, no. This is your moment and it's okay. And you could do it in a graceful way, in an assertive way. So those are the moments, taking it out of the business context. If you're meeting with your doctor about a health plan, about a course of care, and doctors are really busy, right? They'll skedaddle you in and out, not because they don't care, but because they got 22 other people behind the door. But having the assertiveness to sit there and raise the questions and know that you deserve some answers, like those, all of those instances, or again, at the personal level with a spouse, or you're an aging parent about thinking about their ability to continue to live in the house they're living safely. Those are the areas where if we don't develop good conflict resilience skills and just think it'll work itself out or it'll go away, it doesn't happen. And then there's the ailing parent with the 5 siblings that are fighting over what mom and dad would have wanted to happen because nobody actually talked to them. Those are the areas where I think we could all, and when I say we, I very much include myself in this as someone who wrote this book and thinks a lot about this, stand to improve.
When we're having these very complex and prolonged discussions, there are really 2 elements to these discussions. There's the process and then there's the substance. Can you elaborate on how both of those should be discussed? And at first, I guess, start with what exactly falls into the purview of each.
Yeah, I love this. Is such a great nerd out topic for me, Paula. So the process is really the how. How do we talk about whatever is the issue in play, whether it's, again, salary, business terms, price point, covenants, warranties, representations, etc. The how is the process. Or maybe it's a difficult conversation about a political issue. Are there some ground rules? Are we just going to exchange offers and counter offers? Or instead, are we going to actually spend some time identifying together, here are the 3 issues we're going to negotiate. Here are our interests with respect to each of these issues. Here are ways we could address those issues. And only then maybe talk about the contours of what an agreement might be. Those are radically different processes. The substance is literally the discussion about the deal terms. What is the price point? What representations are in the contract? And I think the mistake across the board that people make is they go immediately into the substance. And that often looks like offer, counter offer, offer, counter offer, haggle. And if that's the process you're using, you've already thrown away a huge amount of possible value.
But when I think of a real estate transaction, for example, the process is set up in that way. The process is seller lists the house, buyer makes an offer, seller returns with a counter offer, and all of this happens through agents on pre-printed documents where there aren't humans coming to the conversation other than the 2 agents talking to one another.
Yeah, so this is a great question. which is where are the domains where we can negotiate process from scratch? Where are the domains where we may not be able to do it from scratch, but there might be still process changes we can make, right? And where is it like, this is just how it's done here? Just to use it, I would say like real estate transactions are probably somewhere in the middle. There are some kind of rules that I think are a little bit hard to get around, but often there is some negotiation space, especially if you can do some due diligence and maybe find out who the seller is or what's important to them, or use letters, or once you're maybe within some buy-sell range, start to negotiate some process around other things like dates or terms or other conditions. So I think there can be some flexibility, and I think most of us think there's none. Where there's none, probably, right, when you go to Macy's, like that's the price. Maybe you have a 25% off. I don't think there's a lot of room to negotiate that process. Mm-hmm. But lots of domains, right, there really isn't much of a process at all. Mm. And sometimes you can fundamentally change the process. So I lease my cars, and the way I do this is I turn it into an auction. And like I'll go and I'll decide the car that I want and the options that I want, and then I'll do some research around things like invoice price, dealer holdbacks, et cetera, and I'll wait towards the end of a month, and I'll send a letter to 8 local car dealers. Let's say it's a Jeep dealer, and I'll tell them what I'm looking for. And I say I'm sending it to 7 other dealers plus them, and I'm accepting bids by this time. I don't put my phone number, I just give them an email. And I say I'm just going to take the lowest price. People will play that. Now, that is a process that drives very much to the benefit of the buyer instead of a process that drives to the benefit of the seller, where they play good cop, bad cop, and you have to go from dealer to dealer to dealer, right? So that's a domain where you actually really do have some ability to control it. And I think people would be surprised that in many, many domains, there are creative ways of negotiating the process. And maybe because I teach this stuff, I like to like push up against it. Like even, for our book, right? I mean, we had an agent, but I tried to think about like, where are some ways we could drive value, and sometimes had to even say to our agent, well, I know this is how you usually do things here. And also, can we consider this? And also, what would this look like? So I'll give you an example. Lots of times people create a deadline. Like, we need to know whether you want to do X by midnight. And I always be like, what happens at midnight? And right. I'm genuinely, this is empathy and assertiveness. If they say the reason why is at 12:01, we're going to give the job to Sheila Smith. Okay, that's an actual reason. I guess I have to do that. But most of the time they're like, well, that's just, we have to make decisions quickly. Oh, absolutely. Like, I want to make sure we make this quick. I also don't want it to be rushed. So what's magical about midnight? Right? So in other words, like sometimes there are these process norms in there that we're like, oh, we're stuck with it. It's like, no, highly negotiable. And should be negotiated if you need some more time, right? Not just as a tactic, but they're using it as a tactic to drive a sense of scarcity and a sense of panic. And if that's the case, part of what I want to signal is I don't think that's the basis of a good long-term working relationship. I want to honor your interest in speed. That's very fair. And I hope you'll also respect my interest in being able to sleep on it and have something considered. And so again, there's bringing in like the empathy piece and that assertiveness piece to change a process. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. And that actually answers one of the other questions I was going to ask, which is, what do you do in a case where you're asking a boss for a raise and they shut down the conversation by relying on policy? Oh, our company policy is that we evaluate all offers between December 1st and December 15th, and the potential window is anywhere between 1% to 3%, and it's going to be based on these pre-planned KPIs. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, oh my God, it feels like overwhelming, and it feels like that's completely non-negotiable, right?
Right.
And I think the thing that I would...
It's very procedural.
Very procedural. It's very procedural. And again, we'll just say like, I see. So it sounds like there's a company policy that's really important. There's some specific windows. All I'm doing here, by the way, is listening. What I'd love to understand is, what do these policies get from the company's viewpoint? What gets advanced? Well, that's just how we do it here. They might say, that's just how we do it here. I see, but presumably there's some reasons why. I don't know, that's above my pay grade. Mm-hmm. I see. So it sounds like you're not really sure why, but you're kind of stuck. You need to enforce it. Yeah, you got it. Hey, I respect that. One of the things that I definitely don't want to be difficult, and if you think I'm being difficult, you should let me know. But for a number of reasons, I think there might be at least some consideration of whether this is a unique case. And if we don't know what's being achieved by the current policy, like, I wonder whether we can figure that out in some way so that we can make sure those things are met and maybe evaluate whether there's something unique here. Mm. Now, again, you have to play this out. You can't go too far. You can't be disrespectful, but there's a distinction between aggression and assertiveness. And one of the things that I'm always kind of looking for in these situations, right? So first of all, I think any initial pushback that involves some listening and taking into what they said is appropriate. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I'm looking for, I call this the Wizard of Oz tactic. And it's not done, I think, from a place of a boss being difficult, but they have a lot of problems. Their goal is to get people who are variously complaining and unhappy in and out of their office as quickly as they can so they can focus on more important things. Mm-hmm. So the Wizard of Oz tactic is, I'm going to give you something like, come back to me December 1st, and you go away. It's like saying to Dorothy and the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, get the broomstick of the Wicked Witch, and then I'll give you what you want. And of course, the wizard thinks, they're never coming. These three, I'm never going to see them again. Right?
Right.
Like, he's not planning on them getting that broomstick. And when a boss does something like, it's December 1st or December 15th, or we need to wait 6 months to see your key KPIs, or some one-liner, it's a Wizard of Oz tactic designed to get you to nod and say, thank you so much for taking the time. And then you walk out and you're like, in your journal, you're like, I'm so proud of myself that I at least tried. It's like, oh, yes, I'm going to give you that. I'm so proud too. Yeah. And you could have done that better without being a jerk. Mm-hmm. Because the other choice is not being a jerk. It's just a few more questions. I, of course, don't want you to break company policy. Of course not. And I also want to understand it more. And I want to see if we can be creative. And I wonder if you'll partner with me on that. If they keep saying no, okay, well, you got to go. But like, I want you to stand there a little bit more, Yeah. I think we've wandered far from process and substance, but hopefully, did we answer that question?
It seems like a lot of the work really is in structuring that process, even in the cases where it can't be structured from scratch, even in the places like a real estate transaction where it seems to be laid out in advance, there are still elements of process that can be negotiated.
For sure, right? And I always want to be looking at, so for whenever I can, if I can design and create the process, mm-hmm. I want to do that. If there's a general process in place that I have some ability to influence, I want to do that. And if I can't do those things, I'm going to kind of do the best I can at the margins, right? Now, again, you're talking to a negotiation nerd who's always like seeing these things. I mean, clearly your listeners are going to have to think about, for the context isn't worth it. But again, some of these contexts, right, it could be worth a lot of money to them.
Right.
Both immediately and down the road.
Yeah. But you know what, one thing that strikes me, so in your example of how you lease a car, two things strike me.
Yeah.
One is that you unilaterally set the process.
Yeah.
Right? This is how we're doing it. Take it or leave it. Goodbye.
Yeah.
So you unilaterally dictate the terms of the process, and then by only giving them an email address, you don't even allow for conversation.
Yeah. You're observant, Paula. Yeah. Car negotiations are quite unique. So let me just say, I think in a best practice for any negotiation where there's some ongoing relationship, it is better to propose a process, but also to negotiate it. And so you are a keen observer that I am not negotiating it. I'm kind of saying, this is the process. You're welcome to play or not play. So why do I do that in this kind of a context? I think for a number of reasons. One of the things I'm trying to adjust there are a bunch of asymmetries between car buyers and car sellers. One of them I mentioned earlier, which is just the cost of going from dealer to dealer to dealer. The dealer sits there. I got to go from dealer to dealer to dealer. Not a great situation for me. The other is information asymmetries, right? What I'm signaling is, because I've done some research about things like dealer holdbacks and the difference between an invoice and an MSRP, I'm saying you don't really have more information than me. The other thing that I'm doing here is making a broader assumption of an individual dealer's interests that we know cuts across the industry, but may or may not cut across any individual dealer, which is that marginal extra sales at the end of a month will be rewarded by the manufacturer, both with bonuses and also getting a better selection of cars coming to their dealership, which is why there are some dealers who are willing to give an incredibly low price in exchange for that marginal sale at the end. But what is probably not in play for me here, that usually would be in play with an employer, hopefully, or even like buying a business, is a real long-term sense of we're going to work together over time, or my reputation. Like, I don't want to be a reputation as a jerk, but this is not a jerk. It's just a way of doing this, right? So some of the other things that might be more important to me in all sorts of other negotiations are less important to me here. And I want to try to adjust some of the structural things that put me at a disadvantage by turning this into an auction. By the way, it's highly effective, except in cars that, like, if it's a car that can't stay on the dealer's lot because it's so popular, then you're going to hear crickets. But if you're buying a Jeep Cherokee, it's what I happen to have. They're like, people like them, but they're not special cars.
Right.
And it works. So yeah, but good point, right? And listen, there are times when you always want to lead with process, because process will drive substance everywhere in negotiation. You think about presidential elections, right? You think about our Constitution. It was hotly debated in whether the election for the presidency should be popular vote or an electoral college. And we know, like in 2016, right, if it were a popular vote, we would have had a very different president than we did, right? We would have Hillary Clinton. So the substantive result is very much driven by these process choices. And so that, I think, is the biggest thing I would want to say, again, to listeners. Pay attention to that.
Right. Well, the Constitution is a process.
Yeah.
You know, there's substance in it as well, but largely it is a process. It is a system.
For sure. I mean, as you asked earlier, right, it is a process that balances interests, rights, and power. And its essence, it is a conflict handling procedure.
Right.
And going back to this idea of, do we have more conflict? I think we are seeing more conflict play out in ways that are putting more and more pressure on the Constitution in ways that for some people feel very troubling. What is the ability of this structure and document to hold us together through some very challenging waters on policy issues, on power of presidency and Congress, right? And then to kind of hold us together in terms of our ability just to work with each other at state and federal levels, right? Around national boundaries, like over caution that like everything in the world isn't about conflict, right? But in some level, to the degree that conflict is about management of differences and interests, it is, right? And so that, again, just developing that capacity to do it with more skill and to disagree better feels to me very prescient in this moment.
And that's true on both sides of the aisle, or really every side, if you don't look at it as a binary, but as a multiplayer. It's true on every side of the aisle, from every political persuasion. I think probably one of the unifying themes is that many of us are all nervous. Not to put a bow on it by saying, here, we're all united in the fact that we're all really worried.
Yeah.
You know?
But you know what? I mean, Paul, honestly, I think one of the times when I'm mediating, or we talk about facilitating like a dispute, sometimes people are like, we have nothing in common, right? Nothing in common, except that we're stuck in this fight. And I'm like, no, I'm not sure that's true. I think you're both super anxious. You're both really sad. You're both really angry. You both really feel a sense of loss. You have a lot in common. It's just kind of crummy things. And so the question is there some will here to try to shift that just a little bit? Because if there's just a little bit of will in that, we can work. It might be a little messy. We're not going to agree on everything. But at the end of the day, if the only thing we want to share is anxiety, depression, sadness, anger, then it's really going to be really hard to do anything. Which also like comes back to then just increasing that willingness to sit in that morass of the discomfort, because you cannot get to conflict resolution and you cannot get to a negotiated agreement and you cannot get to problem solving if you can't work into the conflict. The notion that if I avoid and avoid and avoid, it will just go away is fantastical. Or that if I mount my horse with my spears and my knight's armor, I will vanquish you on the battlefield, may or may not work, but even if it works, the cost of that is so high. So we don't really have a choice, which is why we have to do the work, right? The work is not easy. It's doable though, but it's not easy. But the gains are out there. Like we talk about this called the bigger, better offer, the BBO. Folks have to believe there's a BBO on the other side. The reason why I think we've been talking a lot about salary increases, the reason why people think about salary increases is because it's super easy to see the BBO. It's much harder to see the BBO in maybe really stuck family situations over, I don't know, a fight over what are we going to do with mom and dad's vacation property when they die, you know, or how are we going to handle this family business? Like the only thing we could see is like blood, pain, and anguish over, let's say, a family business succession, right? That's like a really big domain of work that I do around family business succession.
Right.
And so if you don't see that there is something on the other side, you're not going to engage. You're going to hope the problem solves itself somehow, and it's just not going to. It's just going to kind of linger and linger and linger until it really blows up in your face.
So by developing the skill set to learn how to ask for a raise, a skill set that it seems on the surface that might apply only to that one discrete topic, but it's actually a transferable skill set that applies to everything, ranging from how to care for aging parents to how to handle an inheritance to how to have conversations with a coworker who is on the opposite side of the political aisle.
Oh, absolutely. The reason why I actually think like one of the biggest questions that I just get from friends and family is this raise question. Because embedded in that raise question is every single hard thing that you could imagine in a conflict. It's partially about being treated fairly and like the money aspects, right? The kind of traditional negotiation, like I should just get a raise. It's also about my sense of kind of self-worth. The no on the other side isn't just, even if they say we don't have the money in our budget, it still lands as a, did I do good enough? Am I worthy? Right?
Yeah.
So the identity questions are there. There's a lot of emotion in it as well, particularly if you've talked about it with family or significant other or spouse, right? You're coming back either as success or failure. There's just a partisan perception aspect of it, because worse than being told we don't have money in the budget is, well, you haven't done those 2 KPIs. Or, well, the reason why we gave her a raise and not you is she's on exceeding, or you're just on meeting expectations, right? So all of the things, it's not just like, I mean, anyone who says it's just about asking for, 50-cent raise, it's like, no, it isn't.
Right.
It's about the emotions and the identity and the doubt and all the other things we were talking about earlier, all about packaged together. And it's an advanced negotiation and difficult conversation, really, I think. And I completely agree with you, right? If you can do that with courage, and whether you get it or not, use it as a way to grow so that you could enter into some of these other challenging domains, the BBO will be there. The bigger, better offer will be there. Because that's the other thing about this, is just, it takes practice. We all have different levels of skill at this, for sure. But Nobody is amazing at it. In baseball, if you're a really good hitter, you're like maybe batting 400, which basically means you're missing 60% of the time, right? That's like the best people.
Right.
Like that's like negotiation. But a sure way to never get better is to never get up to bat. To just think about getting up to bat, or to wish you could get up to bat, or to watch somebody else get up to bat. So.
Well, that is the perfect place to leave it. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Where can people find you if they'd like to know more about you and your work?
Paula, this was so much fun, so thank you. And yes, if you want to learn more about our book, you can go to our website, which is conflictresiliencebook.com. Or if you want to learn more about me and my work, you can go to my website, which is bobbordone.com, BOBBORDONE.com. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
That was fun.
What should a person do if they are in a union and have union-related restrictions around their ability to negotiate for a raise or for any other type of compensation?
Yeah, so this is a challenging question, but also there are some things that you can do. So obviously when you're in a union, the union has taken the responsibility of negotiating the basic contours of compensation. Having said that, at least in my experience, it can often be the case that a particular employee is actually doing a set of tasks that are outside or in addition to the actual bounds of a job description, particularly if they are kind of entrepreneurial. So going back to whatever the original job was and being able to demonstrate how maybe you had 5 or 6 duties and now you're doing 9 different duties, or the nature of your duties have changed, that often is a way then to suggest working with the union, possible reclassification of your job. And then the classification is the thing that will move you up and get the raise. I think it's much harder if you're just kind of doing the same 5 tasks you were hired to do. You might be doing them at an excellent rate. Probably harder to negotiate salary there. I think one of the benefits of being in a union is hopefully you have union stewards and negotiators who are good negotiators, but you've also ceded some ability really to negotiate your salary if your job itself hasn't changed a bit. But more often than not, I have seen people be quite savvy making good cases where the union then is on your side saying this person is really doing a much bigger scope of work that needs reclassification.
We're now living in an era in which more and more communication happens digitally through email, through Slack, through WhatsApp, through any type of written asynchronous electronic messaging. How should negotiations be approached when they happen in the written form?
Yeah, this is a great question. One could write a whole book about this. And there is a lot of research around this. I would say a few things. So first, the existence of email and social media is a great boon in all sorts of ways. And certainly around negotiation, it is inevitable and necessary and helpful that we have email. You could see there's a big but coming here.
Yeah, exactly.
The but is this. At the first moment where you are getting that feeling in your stomach that something doesn't feel right, that someone's cranky, that you're upset, that they're upset, it is time to end the written communication. If you can get in person, if you can at least do something video, something synchronous and spoken. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why. A lot of them kind of embedded in the research, right? First of all, we actually pick up lots and lots of cues in that face-to-face interaction. And in fact, even Zoom is not as good at it. Many of us will remember at COVID, at the end of a day, you were like completely exhausted. Mm-hmm. It's actually because the pixelation is not good enough and our brains that are looking to pick up facial cues and emotions are just lagging. They're working harder. And I want those social cues, particularly when I feel like there's some tension. Again, if you're not conflict resilient, it's really convenient to just write another email. I don't have to see them. I don't have to face their reaction, right? But that's not a good move, right? I want to move it to like live, real, in person, right? We also know that I'm just less likely to name call you when you're in the room with me. Mm-hmm. It's just easier to write whatever that nasty thing is. Mm-hmm. The other thing that happens with the asynchronous is I take the email and who do I share it with? Do I share it with typically people who are going to say, yeah, but consider their viewpoint? No, I share it with my people. And they be like, oh yeah, I can't believe she did that. Oh yeah. And so it actually festers. So I would just say there's a lot of literature on like, when do we use Slack? When do we use email? And there are times when we can use it. Certainly it can drive more progress at times. We certainly don't want to fly out to Chicago in a hotel conference room every single time we have to do anything. That's extremely costly. When there's tension, when there's a sense that there's miscommunication, I want to try to not do that over email. And then, you know, the use of like, I think about things like X and Instagram and Blue Sky, and these are not great places to have dialogue around areas of difference, right? They're not great places to drive deeper understanding. Could we see some magical improvement of the use of these? Maybe. But right now, I think that those spaces tend to be more toxic. I think they tend to not promote understanding. And then I would just say algorithms tend to kind of reinforce that poisonous polarization. And so I'll say this, one of the reasons why I think we're less conflict resilient is because it's easier to avoid.
Right.
Right. It's easier to cancel. It's easier to create my cocoon of comfort in my social spaces. The algorithm will support me. And I never have to see those people who don't agree with me.
Right.
But that's a loss.
I actually have a couple of follow-ups.
Yeah.
So one follow-up is I've heard from introverts who have said, the reason I prefer having difficult conversations by email is because I have time to gather my thoughts.
Yes.
In live synchronous communication, I feel very put on the spot. I feel as though I have to come up with an answer immediately, which is the nature of a live conversation. Whereas with an asynchronous written conversation, I can absorb what's being said. I can take some time. I can think, draft my thoughts. I can revise that draft. So I've heard introverts talk about their preference for it, but framed in ways that sound, at least to me, very positive.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one component of the follow-up. So I've heard introverts talk about the fact that they prefer written asynchronous communication for that set of reasons, which is a set of reasons that, at least to me, sounds very positive.
Yeah. So I am extremely empathic to this. And I'm going to concur in part and dissent in part. So the thing that I want to concur with, right, is that particularly for introverts, although I would say for all of us, being able to take a pause and be more considered is really helpful, particularly in conflict situations where there's like high emotions and we're in what we call our emotional refractory period. That's, I think, especially true for introverts. So I want to double click that in favor of it. Here's where I want to maybe still say, I'm empathic to the writing it out, but I think that what I would actually more encourage is taking just more time to prepare for and practice and go back in the room. Because all of the downsides that I mentioned don't go away just because the person's an introvert. So I think what that means, right, I actually think even as someone who's not introverted, frankly, I could benefit from this, is having a few prepared things to say in that moment when, if you're an introvert, you feel overwhelmed and like you want to go under a rock. Or if you're like me, you want to go bang, bang, bang. Which is just to say, you've said a lot and I want to give it very careful consideration. So I would like to take some time and maybe we can reconvene and fill in the blank. Next week, I could follow up with you on a call. If we've all flown out to Chicago, I can say, can we meet in a half an hour? I need 20 minutes. That's totally legit. And if they say, oh, we need to know right now, what are you, unprepared? I am really very prepared. And part of my approach to this is just, I like to absorb some things and give it some consideration. I think those are very, very acceptable and helpful things to do. I think another thing you can do, I actually have a colleague who is, I would say, an extreme introvert. I love this move. It's really funny. Like, he's done this with me. Before we begin any kind of thing that's like a negotiation. So I just want to let you know, Bob, that I made a pre-commitment to myself to not make any decisions today. So I'm going to listen, I'll ask some questions. I promise you I'll get back to you quickly, but I just want to say I've made this commitment to myself so that you're not disappointed or feeling it was personal or feeling anything before we even gotten into it. So having some hacks there, I think, can help.
Right. And it sounds to me as though if you know that you are negotiating with an introvert and you want to be a good counterparty who does a good job of facilitating that, setting up some process ahead of time where you say, hey, I want to make this a space where you can hold up a little card that says introvert intermission.
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
I love that. You're working with someone who tends to be introverted, setting up some shared norms that allow for that is great. I even would say, if it's a somewhat longer negotiation, as a process rule, saying something like, hey, we know we're going to be here for a few hours. I'm just making this up a little bit, but why don't we say that 10 minutes of every hour is just a chance for private caucusing and break? This way, when that happens, it doesn't even feel like something's gone wrong, or it's just like, that's what we agreed to do.
Right.
And we'll both be fresh. And so I think those kinds of things are helpful. And here's what I'm imagining without knowing, that at least some of your listeners might be thinking like, well, why would I give the advantage to that person? But you're not giving an advantage. This negotiation, this conflict is a shared joint endeavor. The best outcome is going to be one that advances my interests and their interests.
Right.
So somehow thinking that there's a winning involved is missing the point. If their interests aren't met because I took advantage of the fact that they're quieter or more introverted, that's just going to come home to roost on me sooner or later. It's not a good outcome for me.
Right. Okay. On the topic then of setting up a process in which there are times that you come together and then times where you break for that intermission or that caucus. So what this makes me think of are multi-issue, multi-party negotiations in which you might have 10 stakeholders at the table and everyone has a different set of priorities. And in those little breaks, everyone goes off and makes side deals. Right? Hey, we need a majority in order to get to this yes vote. What is it that you and I on the side can work out so that I can secure your yes?
Yes.
I can see that you're leaning yes right now. How do we get to
yes?
Right? And so it's in those little breaks where those side deals happen. How do you manage all of that when now you're not even on the surface, you're kind of having this one negotiation, but in those quote unquote downtimes, in those sidelines, you're having 10 separate ones.
Yeah. The class I taught at Harvard Law School, which is a 110-hour class. Now the one I teach at Georgetown is a 48-hour class. Doesn't really even spend any time on multi-party negotiation because you have just highlighted how so much more complicated multi-party negotiation gets for all of the reasons that you said, the possibility of coalitions, the challenges of negotiating process around that. So what I would just say, we could go on and on, but my most kind of simple piece is first, when you are in multi-party negotiation, process becomes even more important. And related to this, if we're going to take time for breaks, or what we might call caucusing, sometimes in multi-party negotiation, that we also have some rules and understandings about what's happening during the caucusing. And because if there are no rules on that, I think what happens is people are cutting side deals. And then you have these unhelpful coalitions forming. Instead of it helping, it actually makes things worse. I think it also, though, suggests that one of the important process norms in a multi-party negotiation is that there are some really clear tracking of all of the parties' interests in ways that are observable and seen by all. And this is where having a facilitator who's highly skilled can make a difference. Because if the side deals are happening, we always have to come back and look at the shared Google Doc or whatever's on the screen and say, how well are these things actually meeting all of these interests that we spent, I'm just making up the time frame, the first 3 months of our time mapping. And so, again, for your listeners who are interested, there's lots of complexity, there's lots of richness in this. And in terms of process, right, it's just amazing examples of how process considerations will drive substantive ones, and people often just gloss over the process. Let's just start talking the issues. Okay, but that's a danger if we don't know what the rules are.
Right.